You had stories of the notorious 21 Division, long since gone, but a kind of a flying squad which would habitually take off their badges and engage in a wholesale assault on people in somewhere like the Empress Hotel in Regent Street, Redfern. My name's Bob Debus. I am now a recovering politician. I became aware through acquaintances, I cannot remember exactly whom, of two things: of the work of a charismatic Aboriginal woman called Mum Shirl, who was attempting to draw together and to help heal the wounds of the Aboriginal community in Redfern. And at the same time, there was a group of young men who were attempting to set up a legal service. And it was well known amongst the kind of circles that I moved in at that time that there were terrible levels of police brutality towards Aboriginal people in Redfern. Also, in some other places, the Freedom Ride had taken place. I think it went to Moree, and there were common stories about mistreatment of Aboriginal people in some country towns. But in Redfern, you had stories of the notorious 21 Division, long since gone, but a kind of a flying squad which would habitually take off their badges and engage in a wholesale assault on people in somewhere like the Empress Hotel in Regent Street, Redfern. And it was the idea that there was such a profound injustice. This is not an abstract injustice, but an injustice as a lawyer would understand it. A grotesque invasion of civil liberty was a more or less permanent thing in Redfern, and that was what motivated me at the time. And I have a memory indeed of being in a meeting. It certainly included one or all of Gary Foley and Gary Williams and Paul Coe and Gordon Briscoe. It certainly included Ross McKenna, but a very young MP came along to the meeting. His name was Frank Walker. He later became Attorney General and did really very important things for the more just treatment of Aboriginal people. So it turned out that in that room, I guess it was 1970 or 71, a small darkened room in Regent Street, Redfern, you actually had two future State Attorney Generals. So everybody in the room would have laughed if it had been suggested that that might be the case. It was absolutely a volunteer service at the time, and there was a strong association, as I remember too, with the Aboriginal Medical Service. That was organised around the very famous Aboriginal woman who we all knew as Mum Shirl. And I think I was not alone in sometimes spending an evening driving Mum Shirl around Redfern. Another later colleague of mine who did that, of course, was Andrew F. Shorgie, who later became Minister for Health. Mum Shirl was an unforgettable person of a sort I believe we should pay more attention to even today as we seek to help people to restore the broken Aboriginal communities. In a typical evening, we would drive to a house a few blocks away from Regent Street and sort out some issue between family members that she knew about. We'd drive to another house and pick up a box of oranges and take it to a third house. We'd stop while Mum Shirl berated a couple of boys in the street who were not fulfilling their parole conditions or something of this nature. Then we'd drive down to Central and we'd meet people coming off the train at Central and take them to a safe place. Because in these years, in the early 1970s, of course, there were substantial numbers of Aboriginal people leaving the country towns and coming to stay in Sydney. I think it was in significant part economic. And it was to do with the fact that people like the young Aboriginal men that I came to know, Paul and the two Garys and Gordon Briscoe, they had become ambitious. They wanted to, I think, have some professional achievements. They wanted to maintain their Aboriginality, obviously. Obviously they did. And they had a notion that they wanted to make their way in the world. We all tried quite hard. It was sometimes very hard to find ways that we could relate to each other in equality without giving each other offence. It seems somehow ridiculous to be saying that now, but it was so at the time. I had never met an Aboriginal person that I could remember, and most of them had hardly ever met anyone like me, and there we were. These days there's been a bit of a backlash and a lot of criticism of the so-called rights agenda. We don't want rights, we want jobs is an idea that you hear more often these days. I actually don't think the two things are in competition with one another. Surely you can do both. But at that time in history, there ain't no doubt that young lawyers, no, not young lawyers, all liberal-minded lawyers could see that there was an overt and an immediate injustice in the way that the police dealt with people. This was not an abstract notion of justice, although perhaps the way in which we quite quickly began to think about, or I began in the context of what was going on, to think about things like apartheid, did extend to rather more abstract ideas of justice. All of us used to go and demonstrate in the rugby union tests between Australia and the Springboks. I still take it as a badge of honour that I jumped the fence with Fred Hollows at the Sydney Cricket Ground. They didn't want to charge him, but they didn't hesitate to charge me. It's, as I say, no accident that both the white and black people involved in the evolution in 1971 of both the legal service and the medical service were very active in the then famous demonstrations against the Springboks. Young white Australians were similarly influenced by the anti-Vietnam movement, for instance. We had all just come out of the 60s, black or white, and the civil rights movement was clearly important in the thinking of lots of the people involved. People like Gary Foley in an overt and forceful way. Others were less politically intense, but nevertheless they all were. How could they avoid it, really? I mean, there were suddenly, in fact, role models of non-white people. For the young Aboriginal men, I mean, there you were. You had, I mean, I was a bit vague about them, but they had Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and like black men suddenly world figures and immensely influential and attractive. It'd be a bit strange if they weren't affected by it, I guess. I think most of us thought at the time of the ALS began that you would fix a great deal of the problems with Aboriginal communities if you could just achieve a justice equality before the law. Now, I don't think we were wrong in the sense that it is a quality that you do need to establish, but we cannot really be blamed at the time for failing to understand that there was an awful lot more to it than that. And after all, in terms of the direct equality before the law, what we were talking about is getting arrested in reasonable circumstances. We were talking about getting a fair trial with reasonable representation. And those kinds of things were, if not finally resolved, at least those kinds of problems were to a very marked degree corrected and fixed. The fact remains, as the famous Royal Commission, Hal Wotton's Royal Commission, showed was that problems like deaths in custody were to do with the fact that Aboriginal people were still being arrested in wildly disproportionate numbers. It turned out that the rate of death of Aboriginal inmates in custody was not higher than the rate of death of white inmates in custody. And indeed, at a later time when I became Minister for Corrections in New South Wales, it was a matter that I paid close attention to, and almost all of the time I was there, the rate of black death in custody was lower than the rate of white death in custody. But this was little consolation, because the proportion of the prison population that had Aboriginal background increased, and today it continues to increase. I'm pretty clear about this. It was a very good thing indeed to start an Aboriginal Legal Service, and it was an initiative that responded to a clear and present injustice. It was in its own terms, and remains in its own terms, in my own view, pretty successful. But the problems are wider, and I've always thought that people within the Aboriginal Legal Service are better than most at explaining why the problems are wider, better at being advocates for the Aboriginal community at large about all those other things that must be done if we are to achieve social equality as distinct from justice or equality before the law and the courts. In a circle sentencing court where a magistrate sits with Aboriginal advisors, elders, in some places there can be a family or almost a clan identification with the elders. In other places that's not possible. It's just a respected person from Mount Druitt. That's the very point again, is that the offender is not in a position to say, oh, this is a white man's court and it's got nothing to do with me, because there are elders of the community right there on the court, and it forces up an entirely different relationship between the offender and the justice system. So in that sense, I think I regard the circle sentencing arrangements, even if they don't have much effect on recidivism rates, I regard them as being part of the legacy of the advocacy of the legal service as it began. It is very interesting to think about how the senior sergeant of one of those Darling River towns, or the officers of 21 Division may have responded to the idea that there would be Aboriginal people sitting beside the magistrate when the people that they had prosecuted were coming before the court. I imagine it would have caused some form of apoplexy. And yet, this is really important to say, there is no one, in my experience, there's no one who gives stronger support to circle sentencing courts now than the police prosecutors. So the change, it's worth remembering, isn't it? Sometimes we say nothing's changed, nothing's changed. Well, actually, in 1971, depending on how old you are, that seems a long time or a short time ago, it seems like yesterday to me. In 1971, there was not an Aboriginal lawyer in New South Wales. I don't think there was one anywhere else either. There might have been one or two. There was not an Aboriginal lawyer in New South Wales. Now there's hundreds of them. There's a marvellous story told at the state funeral for Bob Belair, the Aboriginal judge of the District Court of New South Wales. I don't know if you know it. Of an Aboriginal boy getting a quite severe sentence from Judge Belair. He got a severe sentence because he'd done some pretty bad things. As he was leaving the dock, he turned to the judge and he said, he said, "Hey Judge," he said, "are you a brother?" And Belair said he was, and the kid went, "Yes." There's extraordinarily precise research by the Bureau of Crime Statistics in New South Wales, which shows, for instance, that the rate of imprisonment is affected more by the rate of recidivism than anything else. In other words, the most powerful driver of this continuing proportion of Aboriginal inmates in the prison system is the consequence of people reoffending and going back to jail. The rate of first offence, and as a matter of fact, the rate of all sorts of crime is not increasing. The rate of plenty of sorts of crime is actually going down. But the problem seems to reside within people who get into the system and then reoffend and reoffend and reoffend. And the issues are about breaking that cycle at the same time as you break the cycle of family dysfunction. Easily said.